So St. Francis of Assisi is a man who understood this last invitation well. Take my yoke upon me. Take my yoke upon you, for it is easy and light. The yoke that Jesus himself took upon himself, rich though he was our poverty. Divesting himself of the fullness of his divinity, he unites that divinity to our humanity and thus becomes poor and weak and humble and vulnerable. He does these things because of a deeper power, a deeper wisdom. It's the wisdom of charity. He comes forth from his Father's throne to take on the flesh and be born to a woman as a little baby because he loves you. You think about what he did. We take it for granted so often. Think about what he did. And this is some Francis of Assisi spent so much time dedicated to building a devotion to proclaiming the Incarnation. Right? Francis is one who popularized the creche scene that we are so familiar with around Christmas time. He spent so much time focusing on the gift that God gave us in his Son. And the why is so unfathomably deep that we gloss over it with platitudes or a shallow understanding of it because its depth is so profound. God took our flesh because he loves us and wants to save us and wants us to be with him. He became like us so that we could become like him. It's a destiny that we are almost afraid to reach for because it seems too good to be true. Even when we think about heaven, we dilute it to such a degree that it becomes cartoonish images of pearly gates and golden streets, clouds and feasts. These are the most appropriate images we can come up with, and yet they fall so short. The same thing is true with these creche scenes that we create, and some of them are so beautiful, but they can never possibly capture the depth of the reality. The second person of the Trinity, the Son, takes upon himself a yoke and a burden that is our flesh. Ultimately translating to charity, because I love you. This is the yoke and the burden that he invites us to take upon ourselves. The because I love you. Do this because I love you. Hear me because I love you. Follow me because I love you. Give up the allurements of the world because I love you. Mock the devil because I love you. Don't tolerate wickedness or those who cling to wickedness because I love you. All the things that we do as Christians can always be followed up with that admonition. Celebrate this holy sacrifice which I have instituted for you because I love you, and receive that love from this altar, from this cross, from my flesh that I took because I love you. And so Jesus invites us, take that burden upon yourself. Love is a tremendous burden. It's a painful burden. It's an expensive burden. But Jesus says of that burden, it's easy and light if you do it the way Francis did it. he let go of everything in this world, which if we try to bear charity and the world upon our shoulders simultaneously, we will break. And so Francis, standing in the courtyard of Assisi with all the town watching, divests himself of all of the grandeur that his father has bestowed on him as a wealthy merchant in Assisi. He gives away his title, he gives away his money, he gives away his clothes, and says, "I will receive nothing from you, my earthly father, for I have found the mystery of God, that he loves me. And it will be upon his providence and his providence alone that I will live for the remainder of my days." And having completely divested himself of the trappings and the pleasures and the comforts and the ambitions of the world, Francis now is free to bear the one yoke of charity. And if you know anything about Francis's life, from that moment forward, it was not an easy one. Mostly because of himself, because he drove himself. He was driven, I should say. He allowed himself to be driven, to be compelled by the love of Christ, to give all he had to the poor, to be patient and forbearing with his brothers and with the insanity of the people who still lived in and among and for the world, to walk from town to town preaching the gospel of Jesus in such miraculous ways that whole villages converted or were reconverted. And Francis wasn't preaching to non-Christians, but he was preaching to the unevangelized. People who had grown weary of, apathetic to, presumptuous of being Christians. People who had set down the yoke of Jesus. It was to those that Francis went to preach the gospel, because I love you. It was no sentiment, and it was not easy for him or for those who heard it, because the I love you requires that we pick back up the yoke and the burden of Jesus. A self-sacrificing, a self-denying, a self-effacing, a self-oblation of the same mantra that Jesus says to us in his incarnation, that we must say to him and to our neighbor, because I love you. I do all these things. I give up all these things. I endure all these things. I sacrifice all these things. The yoke that Jesus invites us to is to proclaim with our lives and with our deeds and with our words and with our very substance the same yoke, the same message that he proclaims to us, that we now have the dignity and the honor to proclaim to others, I do these things because I love you. You have the power to do as Francis did, to proclaim to a world that has forgotten Jesus, presumes upon Jesus, becomes apathetic to Jesus. You have the dignity, the invitation, the commission with Francis to proclaim to that world that Jesus has done all he's done because he loves them, and that he invites them to love him back.